Before we begin, answer me this. Have you ever seen someone in a photo and sworn they were never there? Well, yeah. Imagine finding that same figure in photos taken decades ago, without them aging a single day. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? But what if I told you we're not talking about fiction? By the way, have you subscribed to the channel yet? Just click there, like and comment what you think, because it really helps spread stories like this. Today, I'm going to take you inside one of the most disturbing cases of my investigative career. It's not just about old photos or confusing memories, it's about a hidden pattern that spans decades, connecting different families to a presence no one can explain, and that perhaps has already passed through you without you realizing it. Many people think mysteries like this always have a logical explanation. I thought so too, until I saw this girl, until I realized she appears in moments of extreme joy, and that, shortly after, something tragic happens. It's a paradox: the happier the moment, the greater the shadow that looms. What I'm going to show you today will shake up everything you believe about memory, time, and reality. And most disturbingly, no matter where you are, this story could end up knocking on your door. So stay until the end, because the last part might change the way you look at your own photos. It was on a rainy afternoon that I received a phone call from a distressed woman who owned an old house on the outskirts of the city. She told me that while cleaning out the attic, she found a box of photos that had belonged to the family for decades. So far, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something that unnerved her. In almost every image, there was a girl no one knew. A presence as natural in the photographs as the sun in the sky, and yet completely strange to everyone. I remember climbing those creaky stairs, smelling the distinctive smell of aged wood and accumulated dust. The box sat in the corner, covered by a worn cloth. When I lifted the lid, I was greeted by a stack of photos yellowed with age. In each one, smiling families, celebrations, outings, and there she was, always smiling, in a light-colored dress, looking directly into the camera. My first reaction was a chill running down my spine. It wasn't just the fact that the girl appeared in the photos, it was the way she seemed to belong there, yet forgotten by anyone. The family said they'd never had another daughter, niece, or neighbor who could fit that image. I asked everyone, from the oldest to the youngest. The answers ranged from, "I've never seen her," to "I don't know, maybe she was a friend's daughter," but no story held water. As I examined the images, something began to bother me. Her gaze. It wasn't the gaze of a curious or shy child. It was as if she knew something, as if she were trying to tell me something through each photograph. It was at that moment that I realized I was facing a case that would challenge everything I'd learned about traditional investigations, and what I found in the next photo only reinforced this strange feeling. As I organized the photos chronologically, something even more disturbing jumped out at me. The first image of the girl was from 1983. In theory, if she were a normal child, her face would have changed over the years. Her features would mature, her body would grow. But to my bewilderment, I compared photos from 1983 with others from 1995. And she looked exactly the same. Same haircut, same smile, same expression that blended sweetness with something I couldn't decipher. For me, this was like finding a loose thread in an old fabric. If you pull it, the whole thing could unravel. I've investigated cases of false identities, separated twins, and even people faking their own deaths. But never had I seen anything like this. I grabbed my magnifying glass, compared lighting, shadows, possible retouching. Nothing indicated montage or tampering. The photo development dates matched the period, and the chemical wear on the paper was consistent. In other words, those images were authentic. What tormented me was wondering, how could someone go through 2 decades without aging a single day? And I'm not talking about a mild looking younger than their age. I'm talking about absolute stagnation. This reminded me of a conversation I had years ago with a forensic photographer. He said that the camera sometimes captures more than the human eye sees, as if it were a tiny portal to something we cannot comprehend. And there, perhaps, was my living proof of this theory. I then decided to meticulously record every date, place, and event depicted in the photos. One coincidence kept recurring. The girl only appeared during happy or festive moments, as if drawn to celebrations. But there was one detail that would completely change the course of the investigation. A detail I noticed only when I began to look more closely at the faces of the other people in the photos. When I decided to analyze each photo more closely, I noticed something that had initially gone unnoticed. It wasn't just the girl's constant presence that caught my attention. There was a subtle but unsettling strangeness surrounding all the other faces around her. In each image, the people nearby seemed slightly out of focus. It wasn't the kind of blur caused by movement or focus error. It was something more organic, almost as if that part of my visual memory was dissolving before my eyes. This resonated deeply with me. I've worked with forensic photography before, and I know that small changes can have simple causes. Ambient light, old lenses, even moisture in the film. But here, the distortion didn't follow any technical pattern. It only appeared when the girl was in the photo, and always around the same people. It was as if reality was folding around her, slowly erasing any connection others might have had with that moment. The more I looked, the more I felt like the image wanted to expel me. I decided to enlarge one of the photos in the lab, using every possible resource to recover details. I increased contrast, sharpened it, and compared it with scanned and original versions. The result was disconcerting. The blurred faces, when enlarged, revealed strange expressions, as if the people were uncomfortable, almost frightened, at the moment the photo was taken. But the scene, at first glance, revealed joy. It's as if the photographic record were telling two different stories, one to the average observer, another to those who dared to look too deeply. It was then that a nagging thought began to form. What if this blurring was more than a mistake, or a defect? What if it was a mark left by the girl's very presence? Something that not only captured the image, but also altered the memory of whoever was there. I decided to test this hypothesis in a way that, to this day, gives me chills, just remembering it. My first step was the obvious one. Officially identify the child. I gathered the photos, wrote a detailed description, and began cross-referencing data with civil, school, and medical records from the time. In over 20 years of my career, I've learned that every person leaves traces: a school report, a medical record, a birth certificate, even a vaccination card forgotten in a drawer. But this time, it was like looking for footprints in the sand after high tide. The girl simply didn't exist. No files, no documents, nothing. I spent hours in the registry office, sifting through dusty files that looked as if they hadn't been opened in decades. I went to old schools, some now closed, to check student lists. I spoke with former teachers, retired nurses, even midwives who worked there at the time. No names, no clues. It was as if that child had been carefully erased from history. And it wasn't just an absence of records, it was an absolute void, as if any mention of her had been snatched from collective memory. I then decided to turn to less conventional sources. In past investigations, I've used old newspapers and even classifieds as sources of information. I scoured news reports of birthdays, community parties, accidents, anything that might reveal a photo or quote. In some cases, I found records of the events that matched the photos, but the girl was never mentioned. It was as if everyone there had tacitly decided to pretend she wasn't there. This silence was as deafening as any physical evidence. It was during this search that a disturbing hypothesis occurred to me. Perhaps we weren't dealing with a simple missing child, or a case of false identity. Perhaps we were dealing with someone who was never officially part of this world, yet who managed to infiltrate people's memories and moments. This idea pushed me to the next step, one that would change the course of the investigation. A sequence of conversations that would challenge the memory of everyone who claimed to know her. I began interviewing family members one by one, at different times and places, to prevent them from combining answers. This technique always helps me identify inconsistencies. From the very first conversation, I realized how unstable the collective memory of the girl was. A distant aunt said she remembered her running around the yard in a blue flowered dress, but couldn't say whose daughter she was. A cousin stated, with absolute certainty, that he'd never seen the child in his life. And so it went, vivid memories mixed with categorical denials. In one of the interviews, an elderly woman began to cry as she tried to describe the girl's face. She said she felt something bad when she thought of her, as if her presence awakened a shadow within her memory. But a few minutes later, the same woman stopped, looked at me strangely, and asked, "What girl?" It was as if she had completely forgotten the subject. It wasn't just age confusion, there was a pattern to it, something I'd seen in cases of deep trauma. This reminded me of old investigations where witnesses, even unintentionally, shaped their memories to protect themselves. The difference is that, in this case, there was no clear traumatic event. The child's memory itself seemed to be the trauma. People who swore they had details at the beginning of the conversation simply lost that information as the conversation progressed, like sand slipping through their fingers. It was as if memory was self-destructive when it came to it. I decided to test the resilience of these memories. I showed them photos of the girl during the interviews and asked them to describe the moment. At first, some turned pale, others uncomfortable, but they all ended up with the same symptom: a vacant look, as if they were distancing themselves from me and their surroundings. That's when I realized the investigation was entering dangerous territory, and the next clue would come from a witness who swore he'd seen the girl alone, under much more disturbing circumstances. It was late afternoon when I knocked on the door of a neighbor who, I was told, had had direct contact with the girl. The woman greeted me with an uneasy look, as if she knew the conversation wouldn't bring back pleasant memories. We sat in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, trying in vain to ease the tension in the air. She began her story with a trembling voice. She said that one night she was walking home through the city park when, in the distance, she saw a childlike figure standing under a street lamp. The yellowish light cast the girl's shadow on the damp ground. She held a completely soaked teddy bear, her arms hanging down, her face expressionless. The silence around her was so thick that the neighbor swore she hadn't even heard crickets that night. Driven by an almost maternal instinct, she took a few steps toward the child, calling out to her, but with each step, something seemed wrong. The girl didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react. It was as if she were frozen in time. Then it happened. When the neighbor approached within a few feet, the girl simply disappeared. There was no running, no scream, not even the sound of rustling leaves. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air, like smoke dispersing in the wind. The teddy bear, however, remained there, lying on the ground, completely wet, like material evidence of something that shouldn't exist. The woman told me she couldn't bring herself to touch it and ran home in a panic. I took this account and went to the park the next night, intending to retrace every step. The lighting, the trees, the path, everything matched her description, but there was one detail that gave me chills. Beneath the lantern, the ground was dry except for a small circle of water, as if something had been there until recently. It was at that moment that I realized the case was about to cross a line between the physical world and the unexplained, and the next clue would come from someone who had investigated this before. It was through an old police contact that I discovered a retired detective who had apparently already worked on the same case many years before. I arranged to meet him at a discreet cafe, the kind of place where important conversations can be had without attracting attention. He arrived with slow steps, a worn hat, and a look that mixed fatigue and suspicion. When I mentioned the girl in the photos, I noticed his hands tremble slightly. "You shouldn't mess with that, Katherine," was the first thing he said to me. As he stirred his coffee, he began talking about 1995, when he was called to investigate strange reports involving a child who appeared in photos of different families, always without explanation. He compiled a dossier with testimonies, images, and locations, but something began to go wrong. Documents disappeared from the police station, witnesses forgot what they had said, and the detective himself began experiencing memory lapses. I no longer knew if I was investigating a real case or drowning in a psychological trap, he confessed. He said that one night he received an anonymous phone call telling him to stop. The next day, the entire file had disappeared from the police's central archive. No evidence remained, only the fragmented memories of him and a partner who, ironically, was now committed to a psychiatric clinic. The detective said that the closer he got to the truth, the more it seemed to slip away like a mirage in the desert. It was as if the investigation itself were being sabotaged by an invisible force. Before he got up to leave, he left me a warning. "If you continue, be careful what you find. Sometimes, Katherine, certain truths don't want to be revealed." Those words echoed in my mind, and, as if by fate, my next clue would come not from official archives, but from someone who deeply understood the labyrinths of the human mind. Someone who could help me decipher the disturbing effect this girl had on memories. I sought out a forensic psychologist with whom I'd worked on complex cases, Dr. Helen Amara, a specialist in memory distortions and dissociative phenomena. I showed her some reports, the photos, and described the witnesses' strange reactions. She listened attentively, without interrupting, which was typical of her when the subject intrigued her. After a few seconds of silence, she said something that made me freeze. "This isn't simple amnesia or suggestion. It's as if the memory is contaminated by an invisible trigger, something the mind interprets as too dangerous to maintain." Helena explained to me that in certain cases of trauma, the mind erases memories to protect the individual, but here, there was an aggravating factor. The forgetting seemed to occur even in people who had no emotional connection to the girl. It was a defense mechanism activated for no apparent logical reason, like an involuntary reflex. "What you describe," she said, "is closer to an interference phenomenon, something that not only affects memory, but also the way perception itself functions." To test her hypothesis, Helena proposed an experiment. She interviewed 3 people who claimed to remember the child, recording everything on video. At first, their accounts were clear, full of details, clothing, voice, even small gestures. But as the conversation progressed, their narratives began to contradict one another and lose clarity. After just 40 minutes, 2 of the 3 interviewees were already stating they weren't sure the girl actually existed. It was like watching a photograph fade before your eyes. It was at this point that I realized we weren't just dealing with a physical disappearance, but with a kind of psychological erasure that tainted any attempt at investigation. Helena warned me that going any further would mean risking my own memory, something that I confess didn't scare me as much as it should have. Perhaps because deep down, I already knew that the next step would lead me to more tangible proof, a sound recording that would record the girl's voice for the first time. The audio appeared almost accidentally. While sorting through objects found along with the photos, I noticed an old cassette tape, the kind we used to record songs or homemade messages. The label was faded, with no legible notes. I transferred the find to my portable recorder. Yes, I still have one of those devices, because in old investigations, you never know what might be useful, and prepared to listen. The initial sound was just static, that harsh hiss that chills any trained ear. But gradually, a child's voice began to emerge. It was soft, almost melodic, but carried a deep sadness, as if each word were a plea. The phrase I could clearly identify paralyzed me. "Don't leave me alone." There was nothing else, just silence followed by strange noises, as if someone were fiddling with the tape during recording. The disturbing detail is that the voice seemed very close to the microphone, but there were no ambient sounds typical of a home, no footsteps, breathing, or outside noises. I replayed the recording several times, trying to capture nuances. In one section, when I increased the volume and filtered the frequency, I noticed something in the background, a muffled sound that resembled a regular beat, like a clock or a heart, but it wasn't the sound of a mechanical clock. There was an irregularity, as if the rhythm were alive, organic. It's hard to explain, but listening to it gave me a strange sensation in my chest, as if it were synchronizing with my own heartbeat. I decided to take the tape to a forensic audio expert. He assured me there were no cuts or edits, and that the voice didn't match any child registered in criminal or missing persons databases. If this recording was made decades ago, he said, this child would be over 40 years old today, but the voice belongs to someone no older than 8. It was at that moment that I realized I was getting closer and closer to a boundary where time and logic weren't working as they should. And, as if to further provoke me, the next step would involve manifestations I could see with my own eyes. It was when the protests began that I realized this case wasn't limited to old files and unstable memories. The first incident occurred inside the house, where it all began. The family called me, terrified, saying that objects were moving around on their own. Upon arriving, I found the room ransacked, not like a robbery, but as if someone had been playing with furniture and unhurriedly opening drawers. The curious thing was that nothing of value was missing. What was out of place were specific items, old toys, photo albums, and in one case, a decades-old children's dress. I decided to spend the night in the house, to observe. It was almost midnight when I heard a metallic sound coming from the hallway. Upon checking, I found a toy car parked in the middle of the floor. I knew it hadn't been there before. I'd seen the same car earlier, stored in the attic. I took it back and recorded its exact position. Half an hour later, it was back in the hallway, this time turned on its side, as if it had been pushed. The family swore no one was awake but me. In the following days, other occurrences began to recur, doors closing on their own, pictures falling from walls without explanation, and toys reappearing even after being locked away. One of the strangest episodes was finding a teddy bear, similar to the one described by the neighbor in the park, on the youngest daughter's bed. It was dry but gave off a faint smell of mold and damp earth, as if it had been buried for years. These physical manifestations completely changed my approach. Until then, I'd been dealing with memories and documentary evidence. Now, tangible proof was unfolding before my eyes, and somehow, each new event seemed to be leading me to a missing link in the past. An officially recorded but never solved disappearance that might hold the key to understanding who or what that girl was. The clue came to me during a sleepless night while I was reviewing old newspaper clippings on microfilm. Among forgotten headlines and advertisements for stores that no longer exist, a headline caught my eye: 7-year-old girl mysteriously disappears in San Clemente neighborhood. The date was 1983, the same year as the first photo of the child who doesn't exist appeared. I read every line of the article like someone defusing a bomb, trying not to miss a single detail. According to the newspaper, the girl was playing in the backyard while her mother cooked. When the woman called her for dinner, she was gone. The case generated local commotion. Searches were conducted for weeks. Neighbors, police, and volunteers all mobilized. Sniffer dogs followed a trail to the backyard gate, but then, nothing. As if the girl had vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no strange footprints, nothing to indicate a kidnapping. The detail that made me freeze was the physical description: long brown hair and a light-colored dress with small embroidery, exactly the same one the girl wore in the 1983 photo. I contacted the police officer in charge of the case at the time. Now retired, he still remembered the girl's parents' blank stares, as if on some level they knew they wouldn't find her. He revealed that weeks after the disappearance, they began receiving sporadic reports from people who swore they'd seen the child in distant places, but always alone, motionless, watching from afar. None of these sightings could be confirmed. The case was eventually filed as an unsolved disappearance. This connection changed everything. The child who doesn't exist could very well be the same girl who disappeared in 1983, but this opened up a whole host of questions. How could she appear in photos taken much later without ever aging? This was the most confusing piece of the puzzle. And strangely, the answer began to form when experts confirmed something I'd already suspected. The photos were authentic, and no editing tricks were behind them. I sent the photos to a specialized image forensics lab, the kind that has worked to solve international criminal cases. The expert, a meticulous man named Dr. Alvaro, spent weeks analyzing every detail: the paper's chemical composition, the development date, the film's grain variation. When he finally called me, his voice carried a tone of concern I rarely heard from experienced professionals. "Katherine, these photos are authentic. There's no manipulation, no montage. The child was there." This alone would be enough to defy logic. But Alvaro went further. He pointed out a strange pattern in the way the light interacted with the girl's figure. While everyone else in the photos cast shadows consistent with the ambient lighting, her shadow seemed displaced, slightly out of focus, as if it wasn't fully connected to the ground. It wasn't a lens or development defect. He reviewed it 3 times. "It's as if she's in the right place and not there at the same time," he said, frowning. When we performed a spectrum analysis, things got even more bizarre. In some photos, the girl's reflection in surfaces, glass, mirrors, even the water in a fountain, appeared slightly distorted, sometimes at a different angle than it actually was. It was as if the reflected image wasn't synchronized with the original scene. Alvaro confessed he'd never seen anything like it, and that it defied not only the logic of photography, but also basic principles of physics. It was at that moment that I realized we weren't just dealing with a mysterious child, but with a visual phenomenon capable of capturing itself in different times and circumstances, without aging or changing. This realization led me to search for other possible apparitions, and that's how I found a diary hidden inside an old book, offering even more disturbing clues about this presence. It was one rainy afternoon, while sorting through old objects in the family attic, that I found a heavy, hardcover book, worn by time. Between its yellowed pages, I noticed something tucked away, almost hidden, a small children's notebook, its cardboard cover illustrated with faded flowers. Its feel was rough, as if it had absorbed years of dust and moisture. Upon opening it, I was greeted by irregular, childish handwriting, mixed with drawings of houses, trees, and a recurring figure, a girl in a light-colored dress, always alone. The first few pages were innocent, typical of any child's diary, simple descriptions of the day, the weather, games. But as I progressed, the entries became more disturbing. Short phrases, like "they don't see me," or "I can't go back," began to repeat themselves. One, written with enough force to nearly tear the paper, read, "The gate closed and I was on the wrong side." The words made my chest tighten, as if there were a scream trapped in time. Most disturbing were the final pages. Instead of text, they featured increasingly dark drawings, blurred human figures, elongated shadows, and in the center, always the same girl. In some scribbles, her face appeared almost erased, as if even the drawing itself were disappearing. In a corner, I found the only recorded date, March 15, 1983, exactly 1 week before the official disappearance I had investigated. Holding that diary made me feel like I was holding a fragment of her very presence, a materialized echo of something that didn't want to be forgotten, but that somehow the world insisted on erasing. And as if fate were trying to tempt me, the next clue wouldn't come from a static object, but from something alive, captured by the security cameras of a nearby house. I received a call from a neighborhood resident who, after hearing rumors about my investigation, decided to check the outdoor cameras on his home. He lived a few streets away from the family in the photos and claimed to have seen something strange in a recording taken during the early morning hours. I went there in person. I prefer to analyze this type of footage on site to get a feel for the environment. We sat down at the computer, and he opened the file. The nighttime image was grainy, typical of old security cameras, but there was no mistaking it. A childlike figure, motionless, standing in the middle of the street, staring intently at his house. The detail that disturbed me most wasn't the fact that she stood there for hours, but rather that, over time, her body seemed to flicker slightly in the image, as if it were an interference or an overlay of reality. The streetlights illuminated the ground around her, but strangely didn't touch the child's face. It remained in shadow, even as the rest of the scene changed, as the camera's automatic sensors adjusted the brightness. Reviewing the video frame by frame, I noticed something even more disturbing. On 2 occasions, cars passed by on the street, and neither driver seemed to notice the girl. No glances, no slowing down. It was as if she were invisible to them, but captured on camera. Just as the clock struck exactly 3:15, the figure slowly turned to the opposite side and disappeared from the frame, not walking, but vanishing, like a fade-out in a video edit. Upon completing the analysis, the resident told me that very night his young son had woken up screaming, saying a little girl was in his room, asking to play. This detail left me with a knot in my stomach, because it directly connected the investigation to the region's past, specifically to the land where that house had been built. And it was there that the next link in this story awaited me. The connection between the apparition and the site began to make sense when I decided to investigate the history of the land where the resident's house had been built. Scouring City Hall archives and old newspapers, I discovered that decades ago, an orphanage called Santa Margarita had operated there. It opened in the 1950s, housing orphaned and abandoned children, and operated for over 20 years. However, in 1974, a devastating fire destroyed much of the main building. The flames spread so quickly that some dormitories were completely isolated, and not all the children managed to escape. Official records said 7 children died that night, but rumors swirled that the true number was higher. Witnesses at the time spoke of screams coming from the top floor and a girl desperately banging on the window, but she was never rescued. Strangely, I found no photo or name of this child among the recorded victims. It was as if her identity had been erased, something that was becoming a pattern in this investigation. I spoke with a former orphanage employee, now elderly, who still remembered that night. She told me there was a girl who was different from the others, who often withdrew into solitude and talked to herself, as if she were talking to someone no one else could see. After the fire, this child was never found. and the employee always believed she was among the unrecorded victims. When she described her appearance, my stomach dropped. Long brown hair and a light-colored dress. This historical connection changed the scale of the investigation. It was no longer just a mysterious disappearance, but a story that spanned decades and carried a tragic weight. And it was then, as I researched more similar cases, that I realized this girl wasn't just appearing in these photos or on these streets. Other families, in other cities, had also unknowingly captured her image. It was one quiet night, while reviewing notes and scanned photos, that I discovered an unexpected pattern. On an online forum specializing in unsolved mysteries, a user posted a picture of a birthday party from the night. Among the guests, almost unnoticed, there she was, the same girl, the same pale dress, the same enigmatic smile. The poster claimed he didn't know who she was and that, curiously, no one in the family remembered inviting her. Intrigued, I began searching for more accounts. Within a few weeks, I gathered at least 8 similar cases, photos from weddings, school reunions, family barbecues, always in the background, never interacting with anyone, but clearly present. The most disturbing thing was that, in all the images, her expression varied little, as if it were a sequence of poses struck on the same day, even though the photos were taken years, even decades apart. I spoke with some of these families, and the story was the same. First, surprise upon noticing the girl in the photo, then growing discomfort as they tried to remember her. Some people even experienced headaches or nausea after looking at the image for too long. One man told me that, after examining a photo of his own wedding in which she appeared, he dreamed of the girl standing in the corner of his room, staring at him. He said he woke up with his pillow wet, not from sweat, but as if it had been left out in the rain. The recurrence of these reports indicated that the girl's presence wasn't tied to a specific location, but to something or someone she seemed to choose. This raised a disturbing question: what determined the families or events where she appeared? And the answer began to take shape when I noticed a grim detail. Shortly after each recorded appearance, there was always some kind of tragedy involving those families. As I reviewed each case chronologically, I realized that the girl's presence seemed to follow a dark pattern. She would appear in photos taken during happy events, birthdays, weddings, inaugurations, and within a period of days to a few weeks, something tragic would happen. These weren't simple accidents or banal coincidences. They were life-changing events that changed the course of these families' lives forever. A fire, a drowning, a sudden disappearance, always after the apparition. In one particularly striking case, a family was celebrating their youngest daughter's baptism. In the photo, the mysterious girl appeared in the corner, near the window. 2 weeks later, the baby was found dead in her crib, with no apparent cause. The parents stated that, in the days before the tragedy, their daughter would wake up crying and point to the corner of the room, repeating, "She's here." The story was so disturbing that it took me a few minutes to process it before continuing the investigation. By cross-referencing information, I realized that the girl never appeared twice to the same family. It was as if, after visiting a place, she moved on, leaving a trail of silence and pain. The frequency was also striking. In some periods, there would be a gap of years between appearances. In others, she would appear several times in the same month, in different regions of the country. It was an irregular pattern, but with an invisible thread that seemed to connect all the cases. This mapping raised an inevitable question: did the girl cause these events, or did she merely appear as a harbinger, a warning that something was about to happen? To answer, I decided to resort to an approach I'd always avoided: consulting someone who claimed to be able to see what most people can't see. A medium who, according to reports, had already spoken with the child. It was with some reluctance that I sought out Samuel Denise, a medium known for only engaging in cases that truly challenged him. I found him in his home, a simple place filled with antique objects, religious symbols, and old photographs pinned to the walls. When I mentioned the girl, I noticed his eyes fixed on me in a way that dispensed with any formality. "She's not from this side, Katherine," he said, with a calmness that deeply disturbed me. Samuel asked me to bring one of the original photos to the session. He placed it on the table and closed his eyes, breathing deeply, as if trying to capture something in the air. After a few minutes of silence, he began to describe sensations: intense cold, the smell of smoke, and a sense of urgency. She was trapped in the moment of death, he explained. She relives the same moment, over and over. It's like being in a hallway with no doors, searching for a way out that doesn't exist. His tone was calm, but the words carried a suffocating weight. He stated that the girl didn't choose to appear. She was pulled into moments of intense emotional energy, especially those of celebration or intense joy. According to Samuel, this happened because she instinctively sought the sense of belonging she lost at the time of her death. But by manifesting, she brought with her the burden of the trauma she carried, which in some way negatively influenced the environment and the people around her. Before closing, Samuel looked at me seriously and said, "She already knows about you, and she'll want to get closer." Those words kept resonating in my mind. If he was right, my investigation was no longer just about understanding who she was, but about coming to terms with the fact that I myself might now be part of this story, and this would become even more evident in the emotional upheaval that was about to unfold. The revelation came so unexpectedly that for a few seconds, my body simply didn't react. During a conversation with my mother, while we were reviewing old family albums, she mentioned something that completely changed my perspective on the case. We were flipping through yellowed pages, laughing at questionable haircuts and over-the-top 80s outfits, when she suddenly stopped on a photo. Her face went pale. "Funny. This photo was supposed to be just you and me. But look here." My heart raced. There she was, the same girl, the same pale dress. In the background, among trees and shadows, I asked my mother who she was, and that's when my world felt like it was spinning. She said, her voice breaking, that maybe she was my sister. A phrase I'd never heard before. I pressed, and slowly the truth emerged. My mother had had a twin sister who died as a child in an accident she barely remembered. The accident happened the same year the child who doesn't exist first appeared in the photos she was investigating. My mother's memories were fragmented. She claimed to remember playing with her sister in the backyard, holding hands, but she always got confused when trying to describe her face. She spoke of a gate, a door that closed by itself, and muffled screams. Then, nothing. A voice. And strangely, when she tried to elaborate, she got a headache, as if an invisible barrier prevented her from continuing. This connection hit me like a punch in the gut. The investigation, which until then I had seen as a distant mystery, was now rooted in my own history, and as if to prove to me that I was closer than ever, the girl appeared again, this time not in old photos, but in a current image, captured in my own daughter's room. It was a seemingly ordinary morning when my 8-year-old daughter asked me to see the photos she'd taken with the new phone she'd gotten for her birthday. We sat together on the bed, laughing at poorly framed selfies and blurry pictures of the cat, until, as I swiped to the last photo, I felt my body freeze. There she was, the girl, standing in the corner of the room, partially hidden by the curtain, looking directly at the camera with that same enigmatic smile. What shook me most was not just her presence in the image, but its incredible clarity, as if she'd posed intentionally. The early morning light streamed in through the window, illuminating every detail, her pale dress, her brown hair falling over her shoulders, and those eyes which seemed to pierce through the lens and fix themselves on me. My daughter, innocently, said she didn't remember seeing her little friend at that moment, but that she felt like someone was watching her while she took the photo. I reviewed the image data, metadata, time, location. Everything indicated the photo was taken at 3:15 a.m., which made no sense since my daughter was asleep at that time. There was no sign of movement in the house, and the internal security cameras showed nothing. It was as if her presence had existed only for the camera and then disappeared the next moment. In that moment, I realized the investigation had crossed any safe boundaries. She was no longer just a figure lost in the past, or an enigma trapped in old photos. She was here, present, and perhaps she had never left. That's when I understood the case wasn't over, it was just beginning for me. So after everything you've heard, tell me, would you dare to look at every old photo in your house to see if you find a face that shouldn't be there? I know it's tempting to believe that certain stories are just coincidences or tricks of the mind, but what if they're not? What if the next mysterious entry is from your birthday, your graduation, or the photo you took yesterday? I always say, information is our best defense. If something in this case made you rethink how you view reality, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, question it, investigate it. The truth, however strange, only appears to those who have the courage to face what they don't want to see. Now, I want to know, do you think this girl is just an echo of the past, or something that remains among us? And if you had the chance, would you talk to her? Answer in the comments. I'm curious to know how you'd interpret all this. And of course, if you want to continue delving into mysteries, unexplained crimes, and stories that defy logic, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and follow each investigation. Because if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that the next big case can start with a simple click of any photo.